title of my talk is Under Construction, Struggles Over Governance, Labor, and Technology in Urban Ethiopia. And as Sophia mentioned, I've really long been interested in how ideologies of development and progress shape the encounter between citizens and states, and how they structure local power relationships. And really my first book also explored that, but through the lens of youth, urban youth in Jima, particularly those who were unemployed. And I got interested in infrastructure in part because many of the young people who had been involved in my first research project were, after a long period of unemployment in the early 2000s, were finding work in the construction of infrastructure, many of them traveling out away from the city to work on asphalt roads or hydroelectric dams, and then also many of them working within Jima on cobblestone roads. And I'll talk about some of those cobblestone road projects later in the talk. And so this book really examines infrastructure as a concrete site where the citizens encounter the state. And I think this is particularly important in Ethiopia, which is in many ways a infrastructural state. So here is a poster from Nations, Nationalities, and Peoples Day, going back to actually 2013. And you can kind of see the way that infrastructure is visually connected with the legitimacy of the state in this poster. The writing in Amharic on top of the poster translates loosely as our constitution for our Renaissance. And that's the Ethiopian constitution at the base of the poster with these kind of rays of light radiating up. The dam there is a digital construction of the grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, one of the most kind of significant projects in Ethiopia, both symbolically and in terms of economics as well. You see bullet trains, we see high-rise condominiums. And so this association between the state and the state bringing this infrastructure that is so important for development. And in the past 10 to 15 years, as many of you know, Ethiopia has had one of the fastest growing economies in the world, close to 10% economic growth. And much of that economic growth is related to the construction of infrastructure. Ethiopia is one of the top 3 in the world, or has been in many recent years, in terms of public investment in infrastructure per capita. So a huge amount of money is being invested in infrastructure, which then creates large amounts of jobs. The word for infrastructure in Amharic is meseret limat, which literally translates as the foundation for development. So this relationship between development and infrastructure, legitimacy of the state, is very clear. But if infrastructure is the foundation for development, it's certainly not a completely stable foundation. So images like these really mask the very messy process of construction and actually building infrastructure. We see this also in this another government poster, this one for May Day, but that also features these images of a large-scale, kind of spectacular infrastructure. In particular, the Addis Ababa light rail is featured here. But kind of ironically, given that May Day is a workers' holiday, the only image of an actual worker in this poster is somebody kind of hoisting this flag. So we don't actually see the labor that goes into the construction of infrastructure. And that very messy process of construction is absent in these images. So the talk today, I'm going to present 2 primary arguments. And the first is that construction as a research site offers a particularly useful methodology for exploring conflicts over urban development and competing imaginations of future cities. And that construction can certainly build towards the types of progressive futures that are imagined by the Ethiopian state, but that process is anything but simple, and that these types of images of the finished product of construction, infrastructure, kind of mask that messy process of getting there. So in contrast, this is an image of road construction from the city of Jima. where I've worked for many years. And in Jima, a major round of road construction began in 2009 and was not finished until 5 years later. And so roads like this that were previously covered with asphalt were torn up to make way for new asphalt, but that new asphalt was not completed for many years. And so people lived not with those kind of spectacular images of finished infrastructure, but they lived with this. They lived with dirt, they live with mud, they live with dust. In many cases, power outages were common due to the construction. Water outages were common and lasted weeks, if not months, in some cases. And the construction process was really disrupted by soil conditions, weather, corruption, local relationships with contractors. Everything like this came into that construction process. So the second thing that I'm going to argue in this talk is that the encounter, the specific encounter between the state, labor, and technology is essential for understanding instability and conflict. And construction does not occur without intensive engagement with materials, technologies, and networks of human labor. And specific infrastructural technologies and relations of production introduce limits and possibilities that shape this tension between citizen and state. And so there's this tension between the instability and planning that's essential to the construction process and development more broadly. So thinking about what construction does maybe more broadly for our understanding of development is that it takes our attention away from finished product. So for example, rather than looking at the finished product of the grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, we look at the process of what is produced in the process of building. So that those side effects of development, which thinking about the dam, for instance, would include, or dams more generally, would include displacement. It would also include jobs. It would include profits for contractors, transnational economic relationships. All of these things that are these kind of side effects of development are often more important than the finished product. And looking at construction kind of takes us to those side effects. So I'm going to briefly describe two cases of construction in Ethiopia. And my goal is to demonstrate how construction may function as both a temporal narrative and a research methodology that brings together the state, labor, and technology to understand conflicts over urban development. Also kind of a sub-theme within this talk will be some engagement with anthropological theory. And I'm going to advance a synthesis between vital materialism and historical materialism. So very quickly, vital materialism has become kind of a trend in many recent anthropological discussions of infrastructure that examine the agency of things, looking at things as actants and what things can do. So just a quote from Andrew Barry, who I think kind of summarizes this perspective quite nicely. He writes, "No longer can we think of material artifacts and physical systems such as pipes, houses, water, and earth as the passive and stable foundation on which politics takes place. Rather, it is argued the unpredictable and lively behavior of such objects and environments should be understood as integral to the conduct of politics." So I'm definitely going to provide evidence that supports this claim, and that'll be a big part of my argument, is that the qualitative nature of infrastructural technologies do structure and do influence the conflicts that surround those technologies. But at the same time, I feel like that anthropologists have gone a bit too far in that direction. I mean, clearly one of the things that anthropology has done well for so long is to look at humans. And so many recent anthropological studies have almost kind of forgot about humans and looking more closely at things. So I think that there's value in that and looking closely at the qualitative nature of these technologies. But that has to be balanced with the actual people that build these technologies, the relations of labor that go into this. And here I find it useful just to draw on some of the long-standing anthropological contributions towards just a classic understanding of historical materialism. And then, as Sophia mentioned in my introduction, my dissertation advisor, Donald Donham, I think is the perfect person to turn to that for that too, given particularly his work in southern Ethiopia and his discussions of historical materialism that come out of his research with the Male. So I draw from Donham and his idea that struggles over control of the product of one's labor are particularly important as a source of conflict. And so that's kind of the balance theoretically, looking at both control over the product of one's labor and the power of things, the importance of technologies. Trying to put those two things into conversation is what I'll be doing in this talk. And happy to get more into some of the kind of theoretical dimensions of that in the question and answer session. So the two research sites that I'll be dealing with are Jima, where I've worked since the early 2000s, and Awassa. Both are among the kind of larger cities within Ethiopia. Both are very diverse cities in terms of ethnicity. Jima is located in the Oromia region, but very much has large populations of other ethnic groups. Awassa is, well, it was previously in the Southern Nations, Nationalities, Peoples region. Now, very recently, the Sidama region has emerged, so it kind of represents both of those now. But in any case, at the time of my research, it was in the Southern Nations, Nationalities, and Peoples region. So both very diverse cities. And Awassa I worked in more recently, spent most of my time there, 2013 to 2014, but I've been back for a number of short-term visits. Last time I was there was 2018, so it's actually been a couple of years at this point. So the, and again, the comparison between Jima and Awassa is quite interesting. Happy to talk about that more in the question and answer session if people are interested in that. So the first case study that I'm going to talk about is actually not a case of literal construction, but the case of the Bajaj, these three-wheeled motorcycle taxis. And the Bajaj takes its name from the Indian company that manufactures many of them. And although not all three-wheel motorcycle taxis are actually built by the Bajaj company, in Awassa they're all called Bajaj. That's the term that I use in referring to them. So it's not a literal case of building, but the process of regulating transportation is absolutely necessary for the construction of a functioning city. So the time that I did most of my research, 2013 to 14, Awassa's population was around 250,000. And Awassa is where I focus my Bajaj research. When I talk about Cobblestone later in the talk, that'll be focused in Jima. And almost all of the urban transportation was provided by these Bajaj. They're privately owned, and in most cases, the owners lease the vehicles to the drivers. Awassa is a city that has doubled in population between 2000 and 2015. At the same time, the asphalt road coverage doubled, became a very large, sprawling city. So whereas previously, a lot of the transportation was walking, bicycles, horse-drawn carts, that's really not possible anymore in this large, sprawling city. So to really navigate the city, the Bajaj are absolutely essential. In 2005, there were only 57 Bajaj in the entire city. By 2014, there were 2,400 Bajaj. You can see some of the images here of just the Bajaj in the city. This is the kind of the central area Bajaj of Awassa, I should say. And here you can see them plying the streets and just how important they are for the city. And I'm going to end my screen share here. I'll come back to it for my second case of Cobblestone when I have some more images. But these photos are just designed to give you a little sense of what it looks like, the vehicles. But I think that's, I'm going to come back to just the regular talk at this point, and I'll come back to some slides later in the talk. So the Bajaj, very effective in terms of moving through the city, but also an area of great controversy. So in 2015, Bajaj drivers went on strike, and the city essentially shut down completely. People couldn't go to work. It was really impossible to move outside of one's neighborhood without, incurring a long, hour-long walk. In the words of one Awasa resident, if the bajaj is lost, then everything is lost. Without the bajaj, we cannot move, and there is no city. So this idea that the city does not even exist without this. And this strike was an expression of a broader conflict between bajaj drivers, owners, and city administrators. So in the words of one bajaj owner, government administrators know nothing about how transportation works in this city. Passenger fares, bajaj routes, all of this should be left to the market. Counter perspective from a government administrator, bajaj drivers work for injera. They are not working for the people, and this creates a problem. Injera, of course, is the staple food in much of Ethiopia, but here it's figuratively referencing money. And so that administrator went on to explain that because drivers are motivated by profits, they will not work in less densely populated neighborhoods that are still in need of transportation. And this is sort of an intrinsic conflict in relying on for-profit vehicles for public transportation. And really it's an increasingly common dynamic in much of the world where states cannot or will not kind of provide many basic services, and those needs become filled by private suppliers. So at first glance, this appears to be something like kind of a state market clash, where on one hand you have the market represented by the bajaj driver, who functions as something of an entrepreneur, who makes decisions on the basis of market forces. And in theory, the driver gravitates towards the neighborhoods that are most in need of transportation, therefore avoiding this problem of the state trying to determine where transportation needs must be met. On the other hand, you have the perspective of the state, where regulation is necessary to ensure proper distribution of vehicles, but the state is unable to provide financial support. But in this assumed kind of conflict between the state and the market has long been the foundation for competing perspectives on development. And I don't want to deny that this market-state clash is important at some levels. But my argument here is that struggles over construction of the city through public transportation are better understood in terms of this encounter between the state, labor, and technology. So a little bit about the bajaj system and how that works. So these three-wheeled motorcycle taxis are really common throughout the developing world. And I've kind of become fascinated about how they exist in different parts of the world and the origins of this technology as well. But in Ethiopia, they're quite relatively inexpensive. At the time of my research, a new bajaj cost around $3,000, which meant that for kind of an upwardly mobile middle class or upper middle class person, that purchasing a bajaj and then leasing that to a driver was a relatively simple form of income generation that person could engage in. They're also very fuel efficient, which makes them inexpensive for a sprawling city like this and makes them affordable for a large number of consumers. They have a bench in the back that 3 passengers can ride on, and then they're open on the sides, so you get kind of a nice airflow, which is also nice in a warmer climate. Around 3/4 of the drivers in Awasa were not owners, that they leased the vehicle from the owner. And so drivers would pay, at the time of my research, around 100 birr to lease the vehicle. At that time, 100 birr was equal to around $5. So around the time of my research, it was about 20 birr to the dollar, if that gives sort of a sense of the values of birr that I'll be referring to, the Ethiopian birr. And so the driver leases the vehicle, the driver covers the cost of all the gas, but then the driver keeps any profits beyond that for himself. And almost all drivers were men, with very few exceptions. Therefore, the driver has a very direct incentive to maximize profits, to carry as many passengers on the most lucrative routes. the government, beginning in 2012, the municipal government organized the drivers into specific routes. So they mandated where drivers could operate. And those routes would be a couple kilometers, 1 to 2 kilometers in length, so relatively short, and they would cost 1 to 2 birr. So just for perspective, when I was living in Awassa and teaching part-time at the university, I would take 3 different bajaj to get to Awassa University, and that would cost me a round trip around 7 birr. So very affordable for a university professor, even on an Ethiopian university salary. But just to put it in perspective, that 7 birr for a groundskeeper at the university would have been around 20% of the daily salary for a groundskeeper. So for that kind of working class, bajaj were not as affordable, but people would still use them occasionally for longer trips to kind of supplement, to cut down the length of walks. So that's the primary way that bajaj, and those would be shared. They kind of drive around, pick up passengers, but they fill up very quickly with only room for 3 people going the same direction along the same routes. The other way that bajaj operate is more like a traditional taxi, in the sense that they are point to point, pick you up, take you exactly to your destination, kind of a door-to-door trip. These types of door-to-door trips were technically illegal in Awassa, but they were by far the most lucrative form of work for drivers. They would cost 10 to 20 birr, and despite the fact that they were illegal, people still used them quite frequently, but drivers could always be stopped by the police, and they could pay up to a 500 birr fine. So there was a risk involved in searching out these more lucrative forms of work. And bajaj were not permitted to operate at all after 10 p.m. So we see here just that the state was absolutely dependent on the private sector for provision of infrastructure. The city really can't function without these privately owned bajaj. But at the same time, the state exerts a great deal of control over the livelihood of the drivers. So they control where they can work, they control whether they can have contracts, they control the fares that they can charge. And really, it's only the relationship between the owner and the driver that's unregulated. The owner can charge whatever they want for leasing the vehicle to the driver. At the same time, at the time of my research, the state was making moves to further limit the city's dependence on bajaj. So they were no longer giving out new licenses to bajaj to operate a bajaj as a taxi. They were beginning to push bajaj to secondary streets. And there was a movement to replace the bajaj entirely with new, inexpensive minibuses manufactured in India and South Korea. So it appeared that the state was removing the driver livelihood entirely. And as I mentioned, there's thousands of people that are working as drivers in this city. Now, interestingly, the rationale for this was very much related to the qualitative nature of bajaj technology. So very much related to what the bajaj as a thing, as a form of technology does. City administrators consistently connected the bajaj with modernity and argued that the bajaj was opposed to modernity. So a quote from a city administrator who says that Awassa is a modern city. The bajaj is not good for Awassa. It's better to follow the example of Addis Ababa and rely on buses and minibuses. This is why we need to separate the bajaj from other types of transportation, so that Awassa can become a modern city. And the same administrator, as an example of modernizing, pointed out the rise of motorbikes in Awassa and motorbikes replacing bicycles as an example of modernization. And it was the particular qualities of the bajaj, the way they moved through the city, that was perceived as being opposed to modernity. So a different administrator talked about the way that bajaj closed the street. And in his words, he said that the streets are so crowded with bajaj that private car owners, government officials, and business owners can't move as they wish. The streets must be opened for cars, in his words. Now, and interestingly, bajaj passengers really appreciated the speed and efficiency of the vehicle and spoke about it quite in positive terms. But it's absolutely true that a three-wheeled motorcycle does not move in the same way as a four-wheeled car. They have a tighter turning radius. shorter stopping distance. They're relatively slow. The Bajaj weaves in and out of traffic, stops at will. They tend to travel together in clusters. So they do make it difficult for four-wheeled vehicles to move quickly through the city. And so in a sense, it appears that the four-wheeled automobile has set a standard for how a modern vehicle moves through the city. And it's difficult or undesirable for the Bajaj to conform to this standard. And to some extent, it's the interests of elite private vehicle owners, which really are far less than 1% of the population in Awassa. But their interests overlap with kind of the orderly aesthetics of high modernism, in which vehicles stick to their lane, move and pass in an orderly manner. And so I argue that these discourses of modernity are not simply a mask for real politics, they are real politics. The qualities of the Bajaj shape government policy. And we see this again in another discourse that comes from government administrators that is related to the morality of the vehicle. Administrators argue that drivers are often disrespectful and criminal as well. So quoting here again from a government administrator who says that Bajaj drivers have no respect for customers. They overcharge tourists and they ignore pedestrians. If we let drivers deviate from their routes, they will be all over the place. Allowing people to travel by contract, especially at night, encourages crime. Drug dealers, prostitutes, and thieves all use illegal contract Bajaj. And contract, again, refers to that door-to-door service, essentially functioning like a traditional taxi. And these concerns about morality are directly related to the Bajaj technology. So within the context of an increasingly sprawling and economically stratified city, the Bajaj gives people the opportunity to navigate that city in a way that didn't previously exist. So a four-wheeled taxi, a car, automobile-style taxi costs 4 to 5 times the amount of the Bajaj. So simply unaffordable for the vast majority of the population. And to use a minibus that runs the city, you have to walk to where the minibus picks up and then also walk to your final destination. So for example, if you're a woman trying to travel at night, there's many barriers to that because of potential harassment and walking through an unfamiliar neighborhood, much safer, much more comfortable to simply move door to door. And the Bajaj allows that to occur. Now, a similar degree of flexibility is associated with the motorbike, which was growing in popularity in Awassa. But the motorbike was used almost exclusively by upper-class men. In fact, most government administrators were owners of motorbikes. There was no similar critique about motorbikes and the way that they allowed people to move through the city in ways that were not as legible to the state. And so the flexibility of the Bajaj was assumed to promote immoral behavior when it was not in the hands of elites. And concerns over the movement of certain groups of people only became relevant because Bajaj technology allowed them to navigate the city in new ways. So both the importance of modernity and morality demonstrate the vitality of technology and its importance for structuring conflicts. However, to fully understand the conflict that led to the 2015 Bajaj driver strike, we must also consider the product of one's labor and the degree of control that drivers were able to exert over the product of their labor. So the tensions that led to that strike were directly connected to fuel shortages that began in 2014. So in 2014, there were major fuel shortages. The Bajaj uses benzene as fuel, and drivers were lined up for days outside of fuel stations, losing valuable time that could be spent working because they still have to lease the vehicle, whether they're working or whether they're waiting in line for fuel. The other option was to buy fuel in the black market for nearly twice the cost. So the cost of working because of that fuel shortage went up dramatically. At the same time, the government refused to raise fares that would have been, that fare increase was necessary for drivers to achieve a profit. So in my conversations with drivers during this time period, there was frequent demands for better governance. In the words of one driver, we need a benzene government, referring to the fuel that the vehicle uses. And he went on to explain that, in his words, the owners of power and the owners of wealth are working together to make money. The law and the poor never meet. If the price of benzene goes up, the government always promises to raise passenger fares, but it never does. If the price of benzene goes down, the government lowers fares immediately. So there was a moral demand that laws should serve the needs of the poor, and this was directly connected to the governance of fuel in this case. Now, interestingly, rather than increase, in 2015, when there was a global drop in the price of fuel, the fares for the Bajaj actually decreased. And this is when the drivers went on strike. And the strike was very quickly put down. Numerous owners of Bajaj were arrested. But the drivers were still adamant about the need for better governance. In their words, this is another quote from the drivers talking about that strike, who says, "We're working to improve our lives. Work is meaningless if there is no profit." And he explained before detailing all of his daily expenses, including meals and coffee. And then then he goes on to say that when the government reduced the passenger fares, there was simply not enough money. I could work all day and not be able to eat. How can I support my family? We had to strike. So in contrast, in explaining the lower fares, the government officials explained to me that they'd done a great deal of research on this to determine what the appropriate fare should be. And they shared a document with me that detailed all of that research. And the document very closely described the cost of operating a Bajaj, all of the technology. But interestingly, there was absolutely no mention of the driver and the need for a payment for the driver within that government research. So quite literally, the state research that determined the fares for operating the Bajaj erased the needs of labor, erased the needs of the driver from this equation. And drivers, in contrast, were demanding a state that supported their livelihood rather than an absent state. So when we think about the Bajaj system and labor, we see that the state controls the cost of fuel, passenger fares, access to routes, ability to receive contracts, but demonstrates very little concern with driver livelihoods. These livelihoods were specifically connected with supporting others as well. So it's not just the driver, but many other people. So in the words of a driver, it's not only the driver who works. One Bajaj creates at least 4 incomes. In addition to me, there's the owner, the mechanic, the guy who washes the Bajaj. All of us have families. If we don't have work, our entire family will suffer. If the government does not let us work, what can we do? We have to eat, or else we'll be forced to steal. So it's this broader social network that's part of this as well. And the ability to control the product of one's labor is really at this heart of this tension, because it's not just controlling, when one is able to control the product of one's own labor, that also allows one to enter into relations of reciprocity with others, to provide support with others. And this particular form of inequality, over control of one's labor, is directly related to the Ethiopian state's heavy reliance on markets to move people through the city. And the particular nature of the Bajaj is a labor-dependent technology that government officials perceived as being opposed to modernity. And these dynamics that are at play in governing the Bajaj in Hawassa are increasingly common in a world where states struggle to provide basic public services, and people and their social networks function as urban infrastructures. And such conflicts are intrinsic to the construction of a functional city, and they revolve around that intersection between the state, labor, and technology. So I'm going to move to my second case study, which is that of Cobblestone Roads. I've got a few more slides to share with you here to show some images of that. So here we see a young man building a cobblestone road in Jima. And beginning in cobblestone roads are not necessarily traditional technologies within Ethiopia. Beginning in 2007, well over 1,000 kilometers of cobblestone roads have been constructed almost entirely in urban Ethiopia. And in that process, well over 100,000 people have worked in this construction process, many of them young people. And this project actually originates in cooperation with GIZ, of course, the German Corporation for International Cooperation, as well as support from the World Bank. So it's interesting that there's also these German roots to this cobblestone project. And cobblestone is quite interesting because it's really the state, the city, and the lives of the workers that are all under construction in different ways. So of course, just in terms of the city, cobblestone is replacing dirt roads within Ethiopian cities. So that immediately increases property values alongside those roads. And it also often, there's a number of small businesses that often follow the coming of cobblestone throughout Ethiopian cities. But the process occurs much more slowly than in the case of asphalt. So for example, my discussion of asphalt roads elsewhere in my book that I won't discuss today, there's a great deal of displacement due to increasing property values, speculation. That's much lower in the case of cobblestone roads. But all of the city administrators that I spoke with agreed that the major impact of cobblestone roads is in terms of job creation for young people. And city administrators specifically linked job creation to the material qualities of the stones. The stones must be broken and set by hand, and this is a very time-consuming process that requires a great deal of labor. So in many other parts of the world, such labor-intensive methods actually are prohibitively expensive. Cobblestone is a very expensive construction method in some parts of the world. But in Ethiopia, where labor is cheap and plentiful, relying on locally quarried stones and manual labor is really a means for government to conserve funds as well as create work. And so for the state, cobblestone has been a means of engaging with unemployed youth. Now, a number of women are involved in the cobblestone construction process, but I believe that it's about, if I'm remembering correctly, about 2/3 of the workers are still young men, and many of the young men are involved in the more kind of higher paying aspects of cobblestone construction as well. And so that's a direct attempt to re-engage with this large population of urban, unemployed young men that have long been seen as a threat to political stability. So for example, here we see an older photo this is from 2005 protests. You see these young men on the streets protesting with rocks in their hands, but young men have also been a very much of a force behind unrest. More recently in Ethiopia as well with the Oromo protests. And this takes me back to my earlier work with unemployed youth, when images like this were very common. This is from the early 2000s, young men kind of hanging out on the sides of the streets. At that time, in the early 2000s, when I was doing my work on unemployed youth, young men particularly, lengths of unemployment were 3 to 4 years, around levels of close to 50% unemployment in Ethiopian cities. And young men claimed that unemployment was the primary factor preventing them from achieving progress. And that was a process they conceptualized in terms of repositioning themselves in relations of reciprocity. So they desired to move from a position of dependence to independence, to then accumulating dependence of their own. And that inability to achieve progress was a major source of frustration for young men. And the unemployed young men who were involved in my research in the early 2000s specifically blamed the state for their failure to take on the responsibilities of adults. It was in part because of the common expectation that they would eventually find government jobs, that young men often argued that it was the state's responsibility to create employment opportunities. And many of these same young men that were involved in my research in the early 2000s eventually found work in the cobblestone sector. So you'll see some of the same young men here. This photo was taken, I think 7 or 8 years later. Some of them actually had traveled outside of Jima to initially find work on hydroelectric dams or asphalt roads, then came back to Jima where they found work in cobblestone. So when I caught up with some of these young men in 2009, so one I'll talk about in particular, in 2009, he was doing cobblestone work being paid by the stone. So for every stone he set, he earned a certain amount of money, and he estimated that per day he was able to bring in around $4 a day setting stones in 2009, which is not a huge amount of money, but at that time, day labor was still between $1 to $2 per day, so definitely better than day labor, and enough that it was able to support himself. At least he was still living with his family, but able to cover many of his basic expenses. Now, by 2012, he had just created what was called a cobblestone mahaber, or a cobblestone association, or perhaps cooperative, with many of his friends. And so the way the cobblestone sector works is that young people, predominantly young men, but there are women involved in these as well, create these associations. And the city administers contracts for small projects within the city, usually 1 to 2, 3 kilometer projects. And they bid on those contracts. And the profits from those contracts are shared among the workers. So what that meant is, though he was still a paver, essentially, his job was the same. He was still paving, doing the paving, but he was able to gain a much greater share of the profits from that work because of the shift in the organization of labor to be working in this more cooperative manner. And so by 2012, he had established a savings account for himself for the first time, and he had built a room for himself in his parents' compound, so increasingly expanding his independence. By 2015, he had actually purchased a Bajaj, going back to the Bajaj, and he leased it to a friend. So creating work for a friend of his, but then also a source of income for himself, which is very important. He was married, and his wife was expecting a child. So he was taking on many of these kind of normative responsibilities of an adult man. During the rainy season, when cobblestone work was more difficult to carry out, he was traveling to the Gauro countryside, purchasing sheep, bringing those sheep back to Jima, where he was selling for a profit. So other profit-making sources. So the capital from that all came from his engagement in this cobblestone association. And he was not unique in this sense. Others engaged in different types of income kind of generating projects that were based in the money that they'd earned from cobblestone. Others also invested their earnings in education, either for themselves or family members as well. So the slow, labor-intensive nature of cobblestone road construction creates jobs, but it's not only the materials that are important here, the method of construction and support from the state, that reorganization of labor into a cooperative, is highly important as well. So although cobblestone roads clearly supported incremental improvements in the lives of young men, these transformations were often disrupted by delays between projects and payments. And in some ways, these disruptions are intrinsic to the nature of infrastructural work, but they're also connected to relations between city governments and international lenders, as well as the primary sponsor or partner, GIZ, their goal of using cobblestone to promote good governance. And this is quite interesting. This is a slide. This image comes from a GIZ document called What a Stone Can Do. And you can see all these different impacts that radiate out from the specific stone. So referencing the particular cobblestone technology and all of these different impacts. And one of these impacts is as you can see, the one at the top, transparency, accountability, which is quite the reduction of corruption. So the idea is that typically urban infrastructural development projects are managed at the regional level, carried out by large companies based in Addis Ababa. In the case of the Cobblestone, the relatively small size of the projects means that they can be managed at the city level, which provided local administrators with valuable experience in overseeing the process of infrastructural development. And these contracts are generally for less than $20,000, are low risk, and a failed project doesn't doom an entire municipal budget, in contrast to millions spent on asphalt roads, or even billions on hydroelectric dams. But promoting good governance is also associated with delays in work, as GIZ regularized the system of payments and quality control for contractors so that at each step in the process, a consistent assessment of work occurred before payments were made. And GIZ argued that this process helps local administrators learn to handle increasingly large contracts effectively and efficiently. However, the lack of regular work was the most common complaint among Cobblestone workers. And association members spoke of delays in payments, and they complained that they often waited for months to be paid after completing a project. So irregular work made complete financial independence impossible, and most Cobblestone workers continue to live with their parents. So I'm going to end the slides as I wrap up here and begin to conclude. So what we see here, again, is that the relationship between the state and labor is highly important. Like the Bajaj, the state depends on large quantities of low-cost labor for the provision of infrastructure. In many ways, the alternative to cobblestone is not asphalt, but dirt roads, and therefore infrastructural development depends on this very large labor pool. And tensions often result when the state attempts to manage the people who provision infrastructure. However, this is different from the Bajaj in that the state draws on a large amount of international funding, loans and grants from the World Bank to support cobblestone. Also different in the organization of workers into profit-sharing associations, and that's also very important for alleviating some of these tensions. And provides workers with incomes that are actually useful for achieving some of their goals. As kind of a side note too, I think the cobblestone hopefully triggers some imaginations about how development could function differently. If we think about the billions that are invested into asphalt road construction or into hydroelectric dams in Ethiopia, and if workers in those projects also shared those profits, those profits were not only isolated to these contractors, very large companies run by very wealthy individuals. If the workers shared in those profits, how would that change, infrastructural development, for instance? This is sort of like an aside. But because of the nature of the cobblestone, as well as the way that labor is organized within the cobblestone sector, the state has been able to re-engage with a population that was perceived as a threat. Now, again, not saying that this is complete or that this encounter covers all, even with hundreds of thousands of Ethiopian youth working on these projects, that's still a minority of the vast population of unemployed youth, but it is significant all the same. So cobblestone works partially because state goals overlap with the goals of youth. The state supports the work of associations with contracts, payments, and payments that generally exceed the market value for manual labor, and technical administrative assistance is also provided by the state. So the potential for tension between state and cobblestone workers is eased with hundreds of millions of dollars in international support as well. So state labor and materials collide in a way that has constructed well over 100,000 kilometers of roads, but it's often the side effects of that building process that are most important. And that's that changing relationship between state and youth as a side effect of the construction process that is particularly key in this situation. So we see very different cases of construction between the Bajaj and the cobblestone, but in both cases, it's that interaction between state, labor, and technology that generates conflicts, moves people, and builds roads. So finally, just to return to my initial point, construction offers an analytical framework for understanding development. It avoids utopian narratives of Renaissance, such as those advanced by the Ethiopian state, that mask the messy process of moving towards a desired future. And construction also draws attention to the side effects that are generated along the way through development. And the value of construction as a temporal narrative is that it continually forces multiple dynamics to remain in dialogue with each other. It's during the process of construction that labor, materials, and the state collide. This collision is highly unstable, but among other outcomes, it still manages to produce roads, dams, and transportation networks. Construction, as an analytical lens, avoids getting lost in the turbulence of temporariness. Life is uncertain, and yet plans are important, even when they are not fulfilled. So construction offers a sense of direction without predetermined directionality. Ultimately, construction is neither a dystopian nor utopian narrative. Rather, construction is about the process of struggling over the future. So thanks again for so much for your time and inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and the discussion.